I didn't just hear a snap. I heard the sound of my soul leaving my body. It took 15 years of blood and sweat to build my life, and exactly 1 second to destroy it. The next, I was on the floor, screaming internally while 2,000 people stared in horror. They tell you to break a leg for luck, but when you actually destroy the instrument that is your soul, luck is the last thing on your mind. That silence stretched for an eternity, a vacuum where my future used to be. In that split second, staring up at the riggings of the theater's ceiling, I didn't just break my leg, I shattered my entire existence. I was 23 years old, at the absolute peak of my physical form, and I knew, with a chilling, nauseating certainty, that I would never dance on point again. The stretcher, the whispers, the pity in the director's eyes, it all blurred into a nightmare. They tell you to break a leg for luck. But when you actually do it, when you actually destroy the instrument that is your soul, luck is the last thing on your mind. You aren't a person anymore. You are a broken machine, discarded before the curtain even falls. The months that followed were a gray haze of sterile hospital rooms, the smell of antiseptic, and the droning voice of specialists who looked at charts instead of my face. They used words like complicated fracture, nerve damage, and limited mobility, but what I heard was funeral. They were burying the person I was. I sat in a wheelchair by the window of my apartment, watching the rain streak against the glass, tracing the paths of the droplets like choreography I could no longer perform. My ballet shoes hung on the back of the door, pink satin ribbons turning into nooses that strangled my memories. I stopped listening to music because every note felt like an accusation, a reminder of a language I was no longer allowed to speak. I pushed everyone away, my friends from the company, my family, even the physical therapists who tried to offer false hope. Bitterness is a heavy coat, and I wore it tight, shivering in the cold of my own self-pity. I became a ghost in my own life, haunting the ruins of a dream that had taken 15 years of blood, sweat, and starvation to build, only to be dismantled in less than a second. When the money started to run out, reality crashed through the door of my depression. The settlements were meager, and the medical bills were astronomical. I had no other skills. I had spent my life perfecting the turn of an ankle and the extension of a wrist. I didn't know how to exist in a world that required spreadsheets or customer service. I was a creature of the stage, ill-equipped for the pavement. It was my old piano accompanist, a kind man with sad eyes, who brought me the flyer. It was a crumpled piece of paper advertising a part-time position at a youth outreach center in one of the roughest districts of the city. They need someone to channel their energy, he had said, placing it on my coffee table. They don't need a prima ballerina. They need a fighter. I laughed at him, a harsh, jagged sound. Me? Teach? I was a performer, an artist. Not a babysitter for children who probably didn't know the difference between Tchaikovsky and a car alarm. But hunger has a way of humbling your pride, and 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in front of a graffiti-covered steel door, gripping the handle of my cane, about to step into a new kind of hell. The studio, if you could even call it that, was a joke. It was a converted basement with concrete floors that smelled of mildew and old sweat. There were no bars, just mismatched chairs lined up against peeling paint. There were no mirrors to check your form, only the dim reflection in the grimy basement windows. And then there were the kids. 12 of them, ranging from ages 8 to 15, a chaotic storm of limbs and noise. They didn't have leotards or tights. They wore baggy jeans, worn-out sneakers, and expressions that ranged from boredom to open hostility. They looked at me, with my stiff leg and my expensive coat, like I was an alien species that had crash-landed in their territory. When I tried to introduce myself to talk about discipline and the history of dance, a boy in the back row scoffed loud enough to stop me mid-sentence. I felt a flush of anger, familiar and hot. I wanted to turn around, walk out, and never come back. I wanted to go home and cry over my old scrapbooks. But the door was heavy, my leg was throbbing, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than numbness. I felt challenged. The first few weeks were a disaster. I tried to teach them the basics. First position, plie, tendu. I tried to instill the rigid discipline of the conservatory, demanding silence and perfect posture. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with a sieve. They mocked the classical music, they tripped over their own feet and laughed about it. They got into fights in the middle of adagio. I would go home with a migraine, my voice hoarse from shouting, wondering why I was subjecting myself to this torture. I felt like a failure all over again. I wasn't just a broken dancer. I was a terrible teacher. But I kept going back, mostly because I needed the paycheck, but also because of a nagging curiosity. I watched them during their breaks. They would blast hip-hop from a cracked phone screen and move with a raw, explosive energy that I couldn't comprehend. They defied gravity in ways that had no technique, but possessed an abundance of soul. They weren't stiff, they were fluid, water crashing against rocks. I realized with a jolt that they were dancing to survive, just like I used to. They weren't chasing a gold medal, they were chasing a release from the pressure of their lives. The turning point came with Leo. He was the boy who had scoffed on the first day, 14 years old, with eyes that had seen too much and a jaw set in permanent defiance. He refused to participate, sitting in the corner with his arms crossed, a dark cloud in the room. One rainy Tuesday, I lost my temper. I stopped the music and limped over to him, my cane clicking loudly on the concrete. "If you don't want to be here, leave," I snapped. "Stop wasting our time." Leo looked up, and for a second, I saw the crack in his armor. "I got nowhere else to go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "And neither do you." His words hit me like a slap. He was right. We were both castaways on this concrete island. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the tension in his shoulders, the desire to scream trapped in his chest. "You think you're the only one who hates the world." I stepped closer, my eyes locking onto his. "You think this cane makes me weak?" I let the cane fall. Clatter. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the basement. I stood there, trembling on my broken leg, stripped of my defense. "I don't care about the steps, Leo. I want the scar. Show me exactly why you hate the world, and put that on the floor." That afternoon, the curriculum changed. I threw out the syllabus. I turned off the Mozart and asked them what they wanted to listen to. The bass shook the dust from the ceiling rafters. I told them to forget about pointing their toes and to focus on the feeling in their chests. "Stop thinking about the mirror." I yelled over the bass, my voice cracking. "Dance isn't about looking pretty. It's about survival. Bleed into the floor or get out." Leo stood up. He moved into the center of the circle. He didn't do a pirouette. He threw his body into a series of jagged, powerful movements that mimicked a fight, a flight, a desperate struggle. It wasn't pretty, it was violent and beautiful. The other kids cheered, not with polite applause, but with stomps and shouts. For the first time, I didn't correct them. I watched. I saw the raw narrative of their lives unfolding. I saw Leo channeling his rage into power. I saw little Maya, who usually hid behind the speakers, too shy to speak, finally step into the center. I saw fear transforming into hope. I realized I had been trying to turn them into swans when they were phoenixes, meant to rise from the ashes, not glide on lakes. As the weeks turned into months, the basement studio transformed. It was still dirty, it was still cold, but it was alive. We started blending their street styles with my classical foundations. I taught them how to use their center of gravity to spin faster. They taught me how to isolate my muscles to hit the beat harder. We created a language that was ours alone. And something was happening to me too. I started to move with them. At first, it was just upper body, marking the steps with my hands. But the energy was contagious. I found myself testing the limits of my leg, not to force it into a shape it couldn't hold, but to find a new way it could function. I discovered that my limp gave me a unique syncopation, a broken rhythm that matched the jagged beats of their music. I wasn't the flawless ballerina anymore. I was something grittier, more grounded. I began to choreograph a piece for us, a story about falling and getting back up. It wasn't Giselle. It was us. We faced obstacles, of course. The center threatened to cut the program due to lack of funding. The parents were skeptical, wondering why their kids were sweating in a basement instead of doing homework. But the kids fought for it. They started coming early. They stayed late. Leo, the boy who wouldn't speak, became the de facto captain, organizing rehearsals when I had doctor's appointments. He looked at me one day and said, "You know, you don't walk like a cripple when you dance. You walk like you're stalking something." It was the best compliment I had ever received. We decided to put on a showcase to raise money for the center. We didn't have costumes, so we made them out of thrift store finds. We didn't have a stage, so we rented the local high school gymnasium. The stakes felt higher than opening night at the Opera House. There, I was dancing for critics. Here, I was dancing for their survival and for my own redemption. The night of the showcase arrived with a humid, oppressive heat. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax and anxious teenagers. The bleachers were half full, parents, friends, a few curious locals, and the skeptical board members of the center. Backstage, the air was thick with panic. One girl was crying because she forgot her steps. Another boy had ripped his shirt. I gathered them in a circle. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a fierce, protective love. "Listen to me," I whispered, and they all leaned in, a huddle of sweating, trembling potential. Nobody out there knows what you've been through. Nobody knows the battles you fight just to get here every day. Tonight, you make them see you. You don't ask for their attention. You take it. I looked at Leo. He nodded, his eyes burning with focus. I took a deep breath. Let's show them what broken things can build. The lights dimmed, and the music started, a haunting mix of a cello solo overlaying a heavy, industrial drum beat. The overhead lights snapped on, washing the court in a stark glow. It wasn't perfect. There were missed cues. There were scuffed shoes. But the emotion was a tidal wave. They moved as one organism, breathing together, stomping the floor until the bleachers vibrated. They told the story of the streets, of the struggle, of the joy found in the cracks of the pavement. I watched from the wings, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw the audience shift. I saw the bored expressions vanish, replaced by wide-eyed mesmerization. They weren't watching underprivileged kids. They were watching artists. And then came the finale. The part we had rehearsed 1,000 times. The part that terrified me the most. It was my cue. I had fought them on this part for weeks. I wanted to just direct. But the kids had insisted during every rehearsal. "You're part of the tribe," Leo had said. So, I took my practice place on the floor. The music stripped back to a single, pulsing heartbeat. I didn't try to hide my limp. I exaggerated it. I used my cane not as a crutch, but as a partner, swinging it, leaning on it, spinning around it. I danced the story of my injury. I danced the pain, the anger, the loss. And then, the kids surrounded me. They lifted me up, literally. Leo and 2 others hoisted me into the air, and for a moment, I was flying again. But this time, I wasn't alone in the spotlight. I was supported by the strength of a new generation. I extended my arms, not in the perfect curve of a swan, but in a wide, open embrace of the world. I wasn't defying gravity. I was being held by love. When the lights went black, there was that silence again. The same silence that haunted me after my accident. For a terrifying second, I thought we had failed. I thought they didn't get it. And then, the gymnasium exploded. It wasn't the polite, gloved applause of the opera. It was a roar. People were on their feet, whistling, screaming, crying. The kids looked stunned, blinking in the sudden light, realizing that they had done it. They had been seen. I looked at Leo, and he was smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. The board members were clapping the hardest. In that noise, I heard the sound of my own healing. It wasn't the snap of a bone. It was the snap of a barrier breaking down. I realized that my career hadn't ended on that stage years ago. That was just the prologue. This messy, sweaty, imperfect reality was the main event. We saved the center. The funding came through, tripled by donations from that night. But more importantly, we saved each other. Years passed. Some kids moved on, some stayed, but the studio remained a sanctuary. I never returned to professional ballet. I never wore the pink satin shoes again. I didn't need to. I had found a purpose that outweighed the applause of strangers. I learned that resilience isn't about bouncing back to who you were before. It's about evolving into who you need to become. The physical limitations were still there. My legs still ached when it rained, and I would always walk with a cane, but the limitations of my spirit had dissolved. I was a teacher, a mentor, a second mother, and yes, still a dancer. Just a different kind. I look at the young woman standing center stage now. She is receiving the flowers, the adoration of the crowd at the Metropolitan Opera House. She is the principal dancer, the star of the evening. It is Maya, the little girl who used to hide in the back of my class because she was too shy to move. She points to the wings, searching the darkness for me. I step out, my hair gray now, leaning heavily on my silver-handled cane. The audience goes quiet, confused for a moment, until Maya runs over and bows to me, a deep, reverent bow usually reserved for royalty. She takes my hand and pulls me into the light. And that's when I realize the truth I've been hiding even from myself. The story wasn't about me saving them. I looked down at my broken leg, then at Maya's strong, perfect arches. I realized I didn't need to dance again to save myself. I just needed to pass the torch. My dream didn't die. It was just planted in the soil of these children, and looking at the forest that has grown, I realize I am dancing on 1,000 legs tonight. I didn't lose my dream. I multiplied it.